Okay, we'll be starting in just probably about 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody on behalf of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. My name is Michael Morgenstern and at the museum. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome you to our discussion with Peter Epstein, a German-born Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands. For those of you who have not been to the museum before, Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust is the first Holocaust survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Survivors established a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, they mandated that Holocaust education should always be free to the public, making Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we are still able to carry forward their mission. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Peter Epstein, who will share his story with you. After Peter shares his story, you can type in questions and he'll answer as many as possible. Peter's been speaking at our museum for about 4 years, and we're so happy to have him today, and his wife, Polly, who will be listening from the other room, I believe. Peter, thank you so much for being with us this morning and for sharing your story, and you may begin.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Peter, you can start sharing your story now.
Okay, good morning. My name is Peter Epstein. I was born in Germany. My parents both from Germany. My dad, my mom, my grandfather, who will come into the picture also soon. And my story actually starts with the invasion of the German army into Amsterdam, Holland. It was a rough experience for a 8-year-old, 9-year-old. Lots of bombing, lots of noise, lots of violence, and but my parents saw to it that I was safe and not too much affected by the unrest outside. We lived at the time in Amsterdam, Holland, a beautiful city. I hope some of you have seen it in your life. I went to school there, first in a regular school. Later on, after the country was invaded by Germany in May of 1940, we were moved into a Jewish school. What is a Jewish school? A Jewish school, of course, the students are all Jewish, and the teachers, most of them, also Jewish. Not the happiest of education because the teachers were not in physically very good health, but nonetheless, it was a good replacement. And so I went there. It was called the Jewish HBS. HBS stands for Higher Education, whatever that means. Anyway, so I went there. We lived in the southern part of Amsterdam. My dad had been a lawyer in Germany, where he was born, as I mentioned before. However, when Hitler came to power in 1933, one of the first things he did was to say there could not be any Jewish lawyers. So on the moment he lost his job, he could no longer function as a lawyer. He became a businessman, uh, roughly successful, and we lived pretty comfortable at the time. Uh, we had a new addition in the form of my brother Frank, who was born in 1942. A little unfortunate time because in 1941 and 42, the transportation started by the Germans of Jewish people, and they named my brother after the president of the United States at the time. His name was Franklin Delano, and he is now a retired, successful musician living in Boston, Massachusetts. The addition of my brother, my mother found out that she was pregnant. Of course, her first idea was happiness. The second idea was, oh my God, what are we bringing into this horrible world? So, as the story goes, she consulted her doctor, a lady doctor, Dr. Weinberg, who she had great confidence in, and discussed with her, what am I going to do with this brand new expected baby? And Dr. Weinberg told my mother after some discussion, we're losing so many people these days in the world, keep him and make the best of it. And that's really what my parents did. They made the best of bringing my little brother into this world. And we lived in, as I said, the southern part of Amsterdam. But from reading the newspapers, we found out that daily people were being transported somewhere. No official lists were available at the time. We had, as I mentioned before, in our house, my 81-year-old grandfather, who at the time was already mentally not doing too well, confused, not knowing why all this noise, all this unrest was taking place. And so the idea was to let him do whatever he wanted to do. He walked in the morning with his friends, all elderly men. His profession was a baby doctor in his civilian life, and so a lot of his friends were doctors, ex-doctors, who all went for their walks in the morning and discussed life and the advent of the upcoming Holocaust. Everything was pretty normal in my life. Even in the Jewish school, I got used to my new friends, my new teachers. There was a regular curriculum. It was a regular schooling, I would say, and regular hours. And everything was subnormal, but normal in Amsterdam in those days of 1943. In 1943, in August or September, I'm not quite sure, we were finally waken up at midnight and a loud banging, and that started an unrestful life in everybody's life. The Germans stormed up together with their Dutch collaborators, said, get out, get a valise, put in the minimal things, a few papers, and in 2 hours, stand ready to be transported out of your house. So we didn't take very much. My grandfather was just sitting there not knowing what is going on. It was too late for him. The last remembrance that I have of my grandfather was that he was picked up by some German, maybe Dutch intruders, taken by his legs and his arms and thrown out of the house into a truck. That was the last thing I saw of my grandfather, or anybody saw of my grandfather. Later on, we found out that he was shipped directly to Mauthausen, where he hopefully, we don't know for sure, but he must have hopefully died and not suffered anything further. That left us with my mom and my dad and my little brother. And there we were waiting basically what might happen. What happened was that we were called up to report to a railroad station near Amsterdam. It was a small station, and a train took us, my mom, my dad, me, to Westerbork. Westerbork was a camp in Holland, in the northern part of Holland, not too far from Amsterdam, where people were sent. The camp was a reasonably well-run camp. We had regular food. We had more or less good medical care. It was not what happened later on in the camp where we wound up later on, which was Bergen Belsen. Bergen Belsen is a camp in Germany, the western part of Germany. There is a city of Celle, Celle, and this camp, which had been in existence for a while, and the Germans used it for housing of people before they decided what to do with these people, which camp, there were many of them, which camp to send them to. So we were all then in Westerbork. It was, compared with what happened later on, a pretty good situation. We were together. We were all together. We could walk outside. We saw a lot of Germans, which was unfortunate, but it was bearable, I would say. We were in Westerbork until 1943. So a good 2 years of Westerbork. And then in the meantime, my dad had found out, if you are being sent into Germany by the Germans, why don't you look for Bergen Belsen? It is supposed to be a nice camp, well taken care of, well run, and the big advantage, eventual transfer to Israel, which was Palestine, of course, at the time. You have to understand that since there was no radio and since there was no, of course, no television, it wasn't invented yet in Holland, newspapers did not exist except with their own propaganda for Germany. We were, after all, we were run by the Germans. So we lived on rumors. The rumors was, try to get to Bergen Belsen. It is a good camp. You might get out and be exchanged for other people and eventually be sent to Palestine. And my dad was interested in that, of course. He was a Zionist by birth, and he was interested in going that route. And so we were hopeful at the time, especially my parents. I didn't have much to be hopeful for. I went to school, I did my homework, I listened to the radio, and had normal meals, almost normal meals, yes. This all stopped when finally in 19, which year are we in? 1943, and no, in 1944, I'm sorry, we were sent from Westerbork to the camp that my parents wanted so much, Bergen Belsen. It didn't take long after the ride stopped in Bergen Belsen that my parents found out that all they had heard about the good parts of Westerbork and was basically not true. There were bloodhounds standing on the railroad station. People were kicked around. My parents and I were put into a, well, no, we weren't put anywhere. We walked from Celle to Bergen Belsen, and we were housed there in a very plain-looking barrack, which had been used previously for armies and other personnel. And it did not take long to find out that all these beautiful promises and stories and all that was basically nonsense. It was a very rough-looking place. In the beginning, we had windows to keep the cold out. In the beginning, we had some doctors that looked after people if they didn't feel well. There was some food, not very much. It became less as the war was wearing on. So we knew that we were going to go through a rough time. When I say we, it was mainly my parents. I did not read the papers very much, but I could see on their faces that they were worried by the news of transportations and getting lost in the masses. A lot of people were killed. A lot of people died from hunger. The food supplies were very, very little at that time. I've been thinking about it, and I would say, if you can imagine a loaf of bread in the store wrapped in paper, and you take out the last piece, the crust, and add 3 slices of bread to that, and that was our ration in Bergen Belsen for a week. The bread always came on Tuesday morning by truck, and we stood in line and got our portion of bread, which we should have and were advised to keep for the week until the next Tuesday. Well, if you're smart, you took that piece of bread and divided it in 7 pieces and said, I would like to have every day a little piece of bread to fill me up. A lot of people did it. A lot of people didn't do it. A lot of people ate the whole thing because if you're hungry, and that is a subject by itself, hunger, you eat whatever you can see. The food that was given to us consisted mainly of this piece of loaf of bread, a watery soup, which was medium hot. It cooled off soon if you were late in getting it, and not much else. So the smart people saved for the next rainy day, if there was one, and but there was very little to begin with, and so we started through a period of hunger. I don't know whether anyone that's listening to me has gone through an extensive hunger period. It is not a very pleasant situation. A lot of pains in the stomach, not feeling well, nauseous, and the doctors, if there were any, were busy trying to get us back in shape because they did not want sick people. But if the sick people died, of course, they were gone. There were no cemeteries in Bergen Belsen. Anybody that died is lost, is buried in a mass grave forever. I have here a booklet which I recently picked up in the store. It's called Bergen Belsen. It has some pictures, they're pretty awful pictures. I won't show them right now, of mass graves. People were thrown into mass graves after they had passed away, and no funerals of sort. And these, we got used to the face of death. When you're a kid, and especially some adults, never see a dead person until their parents, or God forbid, a child dies. But we got used to the fact that people were dying, and so it was not uncommon to walk between the barracks and see a pile of bodies that had been deceased and were no longer any good. Some bodies were burned. They were put into mass graves. There are pictures, especially in this book, of mass graves, naked bodies of people that had gone and for whom there is no future, there is no memory, there is nothing left. The Germans were pretty rough at that time. In 1943 and 44, the war started to go bad. After a successful beginning, the war turned negative for Mr. Hitler. And the more negative it turned for Mr. Hitler, the more we suffered, the more rough the German people, the German soldiers were to us, and consequently, from beginning of 1944 until we were liberated in 1945, it was a pretty horrible time. We lost a lot of people. There are some lists available of how many people. They talk about millions, 6 million, 7 million, 8 million. I don't think that they know how many people actually were killed in the Holocaust. We were lucky. My dad stayed alive. My mom stayed alive. My grandpa was gone. My brother and I, we were alive. The situation in Bergen Belsen became worse as the war was wearing on, and there was a lot of hunger, as I mentioned before, very painful. There was a lot of stealing going on, because if you walked between the barracks and you saw a crumb or a loaf or a half a piece of bread belonging to other people, and belonging to other people who were also hungry, but our first inclination was to take it for us, for ourselves, or for our family. This was a dark time morally. People became basically animals, and I don't want to use animals as an excuse. They should not be insulted. But you lost your humanity. Stealing was common, killing was common, and all these things that we are told about we should not be involved in. We became involved because we were suffering. Suffering is also, besides hunger, a bad situation, can be very painful, and so the life in Bergen Belsen deteriorated quite rapidly. As I said, in the morning when we wake up and we would get a little bit of fresh air, we would see the piles of naked dead bodies that had been deceased, and there was no place to bury them. Later on, they found the mass graves where they put all these bodies in, covered the grave. And today, if you go to Bergen Belsen, there is not much you can see of Bergen Belsen itself, but the mass graves are there, and they are listed roughly how many bodies there are in there. No particular names. The record keeping was very, very poor. And what did the day in Bergen Belsen consist of? Most of the day, we were woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Very roughly, the lights were turned on and said, "Rouse, get out and stand in line outside in rows of 5. Why do we stand in rows of 5? We had to be counted. With so many people coming in newly from other camps and so many people dying every day, thousands of them, it was very rough to get an accurate count. So it depended basically on the mood of the Germans, whether this was a quick count, which could be 2 hours, or a very slow count, which could be 4, 5 hours. The appel, we had to stand. Seating was not allowed. For me, at that time, I was in my teens, it was not that big a problem. But for many elderly people and sick people, standing for 4 or 5 hours was an ordeal, and many didn't survive it. The counting was done very meticulously by the Germans with the help of Jewish people. Usually the Germans used Jewish people to do their dirty work, and the appel, the counting, certainly was one of the dirty works that they did. A lot of people passed away on these appels. I survived it. My mom did not have to stand in these appels because she had a baby Frank. My grandpa was gone, so it was me, and mostly standing there talking to some people next to me. I did not really know them, but you automatically start talking. Where are you from? How is your family? And things like that. So most of the morning was taken up by this stupefying, painful appel until the Germans released us and said, "Now you can go back to your barracks." By that time, it probably was lunchtime, and by God, I cannot remember what we had for lunch. Probably leftovers from food that we had gotten before. It was all very little. We were hungry. It was painful. It was sickening. With the lack of food, an illness in Bergen Belsen started, which was called by the Germans Fleck typhus. It was a typhus. Fleck means spots. I will assume that people that got this illness, which was basically incurable, they had no medications for that. And a lot of people died from Fleck typhus. My family, fortunately, was saved from from Fleck typhus, and surprisingly and miraculously, I would say, my family, my parents, my brother, and myself, we survived Bergen Belsen. The end was not quite there yet. One day in 1945, with obviously the war coming to a slow but sure ending, the Germans wanted to empty out Bergen Belsen. And so the order came from above, be ready, get your little valise, and be ready on such and such a date to go out of Bergen Belsen. So one fine day, it was the 9th of April, 1945, we were marched to the close by station where a train was waiting. Now, when I say train, from that time on, trains were cattle trains. There were hardly any windows in the train. There was a small bathroom for 400 or 500 people. There was no food. There was nothing. It was a horror train. In comparison to the camp, I would say that the train ride was one of our worst. We didn't know where the train was going to. Uh, the train took up from Bergen Belsen, went maybe 30, 40 miles one way, then it stopped, and then it went 20 miles the other way again. At the time, the Allies got close to Bergen Belsen, and so a train can only go where the track leads to. You cannot make any sudden left turns or right turns that you can do with a car. So the train went either to the left or to the right, forth and back. My dad, on the few occasions when we were getting some fresh air by going out of that car and sit on some grass, tried to look, where are we? Where are we heading for? There was no announcement you were going here and there. The story in hindsight now is that the Germans at that time decided that 3 trains would leave Bergen Belsen to empty out Bergen Belsen. Nobody knew where to, but later on, after the war, we found out it was headed for Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt is near the city of Prague, in the Czech Republic now, and why that was chosen, nobody knows. But I assume they had ideas of unloading us there, and but there was no plan and nothing. So we didn't know where we were going, and until we were liberated in that train, we didn't know where we were heading for. This is all hindsight. That Theresienstadt was the place where we were heading for. I don't know whether what the camps were there. Theresienstadt was supposedly a model camp. When the Germans tried to fool the Red Cross, which came in once in a while to see whether things were clean and normal. And so when they knew that the Red Cross was coming in, they fixed up the camp. They made us clean our barracks. They made us clean our beds. Everything had to, it was a phony situation, which of course we had to do, and we did. And everybody was a model prisoner when the Red Cross walked in. The Red Cross walked around, looked around, and left. And as soon as they were gone, everything went back to abnormal, I would say. So the train kept on rolling. In the morning, we would wake up, and there would be some Germans yelling at us, "Get out!" You had to be counted, of course, even though who could have left from a train except if they passed away. and there were no new additions to the train, as far as I know. So it should have been an easy count, but the Germans at that time were pretty rough. Their war was going wrong. Hitler was in trouble. Hitler eventually died in Germany. He killed himself. He has on his conscience the death of so many people, not only Jewish people, but he wrote a book when he started off in life, in which it's called Mein Kampf, My Battle. His battle apparently was with society in general, because he spelled out in his book what he was going to do to Jews, what he was going to do to other minorities. He had no use for them. He wanted a clean race, a clean blood, and no mixtures of black or white or yellow. He wanted a clean race. He called it the 100-year race. Well, that 100-year race, as we know, lasted barely 20, and he lost his life and his family in Berlin, which by that time was horribly destroyed. All these cities in Germany, as ugly as German cities could be to us then, were beautiful cities architecturally. Berlin, Magdeburg, Hamburg, all these cities were beautiful cities, but in the war, they were destroyed and burned. We saw Berlin. Well, I'm going ahead of me. So myself. We were in that train heading for somewhere, and one night, we woke up in the morning, early morning, and we expected to be yelled again by the German officers that were having nothing better to do than yell at people. And anyway, there was a Russian soldier. You have to understand that during the World War, the Americans and the Allies came from the West into Germany. The Russians came from the East. The Russians had been invaded by the Germans, horribly suffering there. They hated the Germans more than anything else, and rightly so. The Americans and allies, British, the French, uh, came from the western part, and eventually the war stopped because they met in Germany at the river Elbe, Elbe, and which was not too far from where we were at the time. So we woke up one morning, and there was a unknown Russian soldier standing there who had a smile on his face, and I think that was more at the time than food or love or affection. It was a friendly face. We were then finally liberated in Trobitz, Trobitz. Trobitz is a city in southern eastern Germany. Uh, uh, we were finally freed by the Russian army. This Russian soldier said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what to do with you guys." He did. One of his duties was certainly not to empty out a train of horrible, misformed, hungry, sick people. He got his orders from his general, I assume. Let these people out. Let them live in Trobitz wherever they can. If there are Germans living there, throw them out. They come first. So the first good news in a long time, Trobitz in Germany. And we lived there for a few months. Of course, we came out of this camp pretty ill and had to be helped to get better. And the cities the citizens of Trobitz were told, this is a train of people. A lot of them are dead. A lot of them are dying. We order you that the school children should take care of the gravesites in Trobitz. And if any of you go to Trobitz today, I went there a few years ago with my wife. The school children in Trobitz are taking care of the remnants of the bodies that are buried in Trobitz. The grave sites are cleaned by the children. And when we went back there, when my wife and I went back there, well, not recently, but quite a while ago, we saw how well and how beautiful these grave sites are taken care of by Germans, children, of Jewish people. I have pictures at home of the grave sites to prove that what I saw is true. We lived in Trobitz on a farm. Now you have to imagine that all these emaciated people that walked out of that train in Trobitz suddenly were living in a farm. There were pigs, there were chickens, there were horses, there were all kinds of animals. And there was an empty farm where we walked into, and that became our home for a little while under the supervision of the Russians, who brought in a voluminous amount of nurses, doctors, and medical supplies to get us better again. It took a long time. For my mother, for instance, who had not eaten very much in the camp either, suddenly in Trobitz, there was a farm with chickens and pigs, and so plenty of food. And you know, the automatic feeling was, hey, I can eat now. And to eat a normal or a subnormal amount of food on an empty stomach is not doing the body any good either. So she and many others were ill with the stomach. And the Russians had set up, like I said, a huge medical corps to take care of us. Whatever we found out negatively about the Russians and the Russian army and the Russian politics and all that, take that into account. They were our saviors at the time, accidentally, not planned, but they ran into us while we were dying and took care of us. And so it was one of the few positive things that a Russian did. I have one side story of my brother, who was at that time 3 years old, 2 or 3 years old. He cried a lot. His tummy was hurting too. He was drinking a lot of milk, but he did not get all the nourishing foods that a baby should have, and so he cried a lot. He cried a lot, and I remember that where we lived, one day there was a knock on the door, and there was a very rough-looking Russian soldier standing there with his gun, his arm full of watches. The Russians were fascinated by watches. They stole them from everybody that they could and put them on their arm. Their biggest pride was to show a row of watches like this. For whatever use, I don't know. You only need one watch to tell you what time of the day it is. But that they were also pretty rough with women. They liked women a lot, especially soldiers, like most soldiers do. And so we had basically a decent time in Trobitz after we were liberated. From Trobitz, finally, we were picked up by the American army in big trucks. They took us to Leipzig. Leipzig is a beautiful German city, looking horribly destroyed, bombed, burned. Another fatality in this stupid war. And so we lived in Trobitz for a while, and then the Americans sent us in it by train, and it was a decent train, back to Amsterdam, where we were greeted by our friends, and we were living in their house for a while to get used to a new free life, plenty of food. However, coming into Holland, the Dutch said, yeah, we will take all of them, but we will have to check them out, how they're doing medically. Well, lucky me, they found out that I had TB. At the time, TB was an illness which there was a cure for it. I believe the cure was in the United States, penicillin. But to get penicillin was very difficult. So after I got to a hospital back in Amsterdam, the doctors recommended that I should go to Switzerland. Switzerland is known for its fresh air, the Alps, high up, plenty of food. And that at the time was the only cure for my illness and many other illness. Feed them, let them lay out in fresh air. So I went to a sanitarium in Davos, Davos, where we were sleeping outside. We were during the day outside. We had 3 magnificent full meals. It was handled better than in Trobitz, so we did not get sick from eating. And slowly, I got better. At the time, the checking for how well you were doing with tuberculosis was to put a hose down your throat, probably the same way as they do these days when they check for the virus, and a hose that would go towards your stomach. Then they would take some fluid and they would see whether there are any bacillus in there. Bacillus, of course, are negative. They're not very good. And I had bacillus for a long time. But the rest, the good food, the fresh air, the long walks, it did me well. Unfortunately, at that time, I got a call from home from my mom that my dad needed surgery. And this was a surgery where the doctor said, we would not like to do surgery on this person because he's most likely not going to survive it. My dad was very much weakened by Bergen Belsen and never recuperated. He had a gallbladder infection and very painful. And so while I was still in Switzerland, my mom had to decide that to have my dad to get his surgery, which was a successful surgery, but he did not survive it. So cannot talk about it being very successful. He died in 1947, 2 years after we were liberated, and never lived a normal life after the camp, even though he was doing some business in his field. And my brother was growing up, going to school. I, with my tuberculosis, had to be careful. First, the doctor said I could only go to school half days, then 3/4 of a day, and finally full time. I missed a lot of schooling, and I like to blame it on my poor doing in schools in general. But I don't know whether that is. I never was very good at school, and but I got my final exam in and could go to work. My my work was in Amsterdam, accountant. I worked first for an accountant. Later on, I went on my own and did it from the house. I had a little office at home. It's like this little office here in our apartment, and and I kept it until I got too old. I'm now, as I told you, probably 88. When I was 78, 80, I think I gave it up and have been retired ever since. What makes my life worthwhile? Number one is my family. I have a lovely wife, Polly. She is in the next room over there, who's helping me very much to get through my elderly days. I have a lovely two children, a son and a daughter from different mothers. I was married three times. Unfortunately, the first time ended in divorce. The second time ended in the death of my wife. And the third one is Polly, who's sitting in the other room. It's been otherwise. Well, then we were in Holland, and my mother saw that it was difficult to find jobs after the war, and so we had friends in America who said, "Why don't you bring the kids over to America?" They lived in Los Angeles, and one day my mom decided, with the help of friends, to get us packed up, and we made our last trip, I hope, big trip, to Los Angeles. We landed here in 1952. The beginnings in America were not easy. We had to settle down. We had to find a place to live. We had to find a job. We did all that. But for my mom, it was the rest of her life was very difficult because of health reasons. As I told you, she became very heavy, and because of the amount of food that we were taking in after a whole period of barely any food. And so she died at a good age a few years ago. I still have my two children, of course, who are all doing reasonably well. And so the last years of my life so far have been well. There has been death in the family, like in most families. There have been illnesses, like in most families. But in generally, I would say that after the camp, it was horrible. Life turned for the better again. It was helped very much by my mom, who got me into classical music. Classical music was for me like a medication. Whenever I was low in my spirits because of marriages or health wise, whatever, there was always classical music. Melodies, rhythms of the classical composers were my new medication, and they helped me along, and they help me along these days. I try to listen as much as I can. Recognizing music becomes more and more difficult at my age, whereas before I could pick out any radio melody and say, this is this and that by this and that composer. Now I have problems with that, which hurts me a little bit, but still listening to classical music or going out to a theater, which is now very seldom, was the other highlights in my life besides having my family around me. This is basically the story of the Holocaust. There's a whole life after the Holocaust, which I will not go into, or maybe have a little bit already. We are, Polly and I live in a lovely apartment, which we are in right now. It is mostly for elderly people. We are taking care of ourselves. We have our own food. Of course, it's difficult to get food in the present circumstances of the virus that's going on. At this point, I would like to bring up something that I thought of when I was preparing for this session. Daily, we read in the paper and we hear of that when we go outside, we should wear a mask. When we go outside, we should not be in large groups of people without masks, or even more than X amount of people. These are all restrictions, similar to the restrictions that we had during the war, except during the war, the restrictions that the Germans put on us were not for our benefit, they were to punish us. What were we punished for? We were punished because we were Jewish. Jewish is a nice religion, always has been. I am not very religious. I am not going to too many services, but I feel Jewish in my body. My children do the same thing. And together with music, it has made my life very, very pleasant in time, even though I was without a father. My mother eventually died, of course. And so there's a lot of sweetness in life besides blackness. We had an extraordinary amount of blackness with the camps, with the persecution of Jewish people. But now we are free. We're living in a free country. We may not always agree with the politics from either side, but it is a free country, and they allow us to live as normal as we would like it to be. This is basically the end of my story. It's 12 o'clock now. Michael, I was wondering whether we could bring this to an end, or do you want me to go on?
Well, I would like to read some questions that we have from members of the audience.
Yeah, good, please.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Your story is, we had so many comments from people just thanking you very much, and we really appreciate this.
Okay, but I was happy to do it, even though going through all these stories again was kind of painful. But I know it's for a good purpose. Okay.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I had a problem with the internet for a second. So your story is very unique in that your brother was so young and he survived. Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Frank, as I said, he lived at home until he went to University of USC in Los Angeles, and now lives with his family. He has two lovely children and a lovely wife in Boston. He was a very successful percussion player with the Boston Symphony, which was my envy always. He played it and I listened to it only. And he has written a book about percussion because he became an expert in percussion. As I said, there's a little booklet, quite a booklet actually, of the techniques that timpani players and percussionists are using. He is, he survived. His survival was as miraculous, I guess, as mine, and as anybody who survived this horrible situation. You see, when I tell my story, I basically understate. It is my way of dealing with it. I cannot overstate. I cannot make it worse than it is. I definitely don't want to make it better than it is. I would want to stay as truthful, and for that I have to rehearse before I come here to remember it's so many years ago. So many other things have happened, good and bad, that you have to sift out what was bad, what was good, and I would say, all in all, with Bergen Belsen, with Trobitz and all that, it was, I consider it a good life. Financially, not very successful, but it was a good life. I have a good family. I cherish family life. And my children are lovely human beings who right now only can call me and say hello and how are you doing, like all these other people whose children are far away. Holly, who is sitting next to me now, has two lovely has had one child, a daughter, and two lovely grandchildren, which she hasn't seen now for 4, 5, 6 months. They live in New Jersey. And again, thanks to the phones, they can stay in touch. And my wife Polly likes the daily calls at around 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, when Amy, her daughter, calls, and she can see pictures and talk to the grandchildren. We have had various informal Zoom meetings with family, with Frank in Boston. My very first Zoom meeting was a Seder, which was run by a relative in England, and the whole family sat through the whole Seder by Zoom. It was a such unnatural experience. Lovely at the end when the Seder is over and you can talk about it. It is always positive. The food is good. The preparations are done lovely by the ladies in the family, and so there has been a lot of good in life too. For my brother, which you asked about, he had a good life, a successful life, even though he was born in horror, and of course he lost his mom and his dad also. He barely knew his dad. My dad, our dad, died in 1947 when Frank was 5 years old, 4 years old, five, and they hardly knew each other. My dad was ill most of the time and could not be very active with Frank. So my mom, who was a very, very strong woman at that time, uh, physically doing well, and had numerous ideas. I would like to mention that my mom has written a biography of her life, which to me is very interesting to the extent that she tells about when she was a girl in Breslau. She was from Glatz, which is Glatz, which is near Breslau. We have been there. And she has written for Frank and for me the story of her youth. My mom was born in 1906, so a good 26 years before me. And I was born, and it isn't, when we went back to Glatz and to Breslau, we found so many things that she writes about the marketplace, the university in Breslau, world famous and thriving, an interesting city. We went back there a couple of times, and so we have my mom's book, which apparently, hopefully, will be published in a short time. It is being looked at by various people who said this is a good and interesting an educational story of how life was in Europe and especially Germany in the 20s and the 30s.
You ask more questions.
Okay. Are there any more questions, Michael?
Thank you, Peter. Do you remember how your brother was able to have enough nutrition to survive in Bergen Belsen?
Nursing. She was nursing him.
Okay. Well, he was a baby. My brother is born in 1942. In 1943, at the age of 1 year, he was in a concentration camp. There was some kind of fluid which was called milk, which was milk plus a lot of water, because the Germans were very careful not to give us too much food. So he lived on reduced rations and consequently had all his baby illnesses in the camp in Bergen Belsen and before. He turned out to be a very healthy human being and lived a very nice life in, like I said, in Boston.
Did you tell him the story of Frank and the Russian car?
Okay. Polly, this reminds me of the story of Frank, who in Trobitz, where we were liberated by the Russian army, who my brother was crying a lot. Obviously, he didn't like to be hungry as a 1 year or 2 year old baby, and he cried a lot. And nobody could quiet him down. My mom tried, wasn't very successful. I tried. My dad, as long as he could, probably tried. One day, a Russian soldier entered the house where we were living in Trobitz, heard Frank cry, and somehow brought in a ukulele or some kind of instrument, and he sang for Frank, 1 or 2 years old, and calmed him down. Basically, an unlikely story, maybe an unimportant story, but it was at the time something that kept us optimistic with music around and with goodwill. Yes.
Thank you. That's it's a really relevant story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know you mentioned one of your grandfathers earlier, but do you have any ideas what happened to the rest of your family, your other grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins?
I never knew my I have two parents, and my dad's family I met. My mother's family I heard about a lot. When we were, before we went into the camp, we visited my grandmother, who was, of course, elderly at the time also, not very happy because her daughter was in another country. She became very ill and she committed, as I was told, she committed suicide before the Germans got to her. And so she was never persecuted by the Germans, but she must have been very lonely. I have a very rich in volume family all over the world, in Palestine, now in Israel, in America at the time, in England, and I got to see them after the war, slowly but surely. I always had a good time with them, and there is a whole bunch of family that I didn't get to see. They lived too far, or they didn't visit us, and we certainly could not visit them. So I'm missing a lot of family in my diary of family members. I've heard of them. I've talked to them on the phone once in a while, but never got to meet them. But my grandpa, the one and only grandpa, a lovely person. You couldn't imagine a more enjoyable grandpa to have, who sat with me for hours and played Monopoly and made, without him knowing really what was going on, he had his cards in his hands and he tried to read the names of the various streets or cities that they talk about. He was very, very much interested in collecting as much paper money as possible. So he was a happy winner and he was an unhappy loser. He was a very human being, which he had to be as a family and children doctor. I do remember that when he lived in our house, whenever I sneezed, he says, "Come with me to my room. I have something for that." And he had a coterie of pills and powders and whatever it may have been. My parents always made sure that it was something that was healthy for me, and before I took it. And the same thing with Frank. Uh, you know, uh, he lived such a short life, basically, even though he became 80 years old. The last 10, 15, 20 years were hell for him. Besides old age, he was mentally not fit to think straight. My parents thought for him and made him feel as comfortable as possible. He was a good friend to Frank and to me. And so the other grandparents I never got to meet. I heard about them, I read about them, but never had any personal contact with them.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really important to highlight the characters and the personalities of these victims. So I'm really glad that you remember that about your grandfather.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any of these easily accessible nearby, but a few of the audience members would like to see photos of your parents and of your brother. Do you happen to have any of those nearby? If not, oh, okay, thank you. We'd love to see those.
Polly's getting them.
While,
We have them in the living
okay,
room mostly. The picture of my parents basically is known very well to the museum because I always had them when I gave my lecture. I had them behind me, kind of like a kind of protection.
I know how to hold. If you hold them like this, can you see, Michael?
yes.
Those two are Peter's grandchildren,
Yeah.
his daughter's children.
Yeah.
And they are now 7 and 11. And this is Peter's mother. Close so they can see.
A beautiful red head. She had very unusual bright red head. People commented it up it quite often. She basically makes the story kind of long. And
yeah,
the Jewish Council. Are you familiar with the Jewish Council? That who were later on condemned that they had collaborated with the Germans, and to a certain extent they had. My dad, who was a lawyer, as I told you, was asked by the Germans once they occupied Holland to help them with the transportation and the registration of people that they wanted to take out.
This is the grandma.
This is my grandfather. His name is Eugene. He became roughly 80 years old, like I am now. And
this is his father.
And this is my dad. Can you see?
There.
Yes.
This is my father. He died at the age of 47. And after a pretty rough life. As I said, he was an attorney, later on a businessman in Holland, very successful. And
yeah, there's the pediatrician, grandpa.
Oh, my grandpa, Eugene. A horrible ending. I mean, it can't be emphasized. I saw it, I believe, in hindsight, that we saw him being thrown, not walked into because he couldn't walk, into a truck and taken off. according to the records that are available these days, he went to Sobibor, which is right next to Auschwitz. And if he went there, then our only hope is that he never suffered very long, because he did not suffer in Sobibor and Auschwitz. You were gassed and murdered by the Germans. The rest of the family is all further away. I'm lucky that I had a very lucky family, and life has not been overly easy. I went through a miserable divorce with my first wife. We are now friends. I went the death of my second wife, who was from Holland also. So I learned my Dutch again from her and her family. And then when she died, I was lucky enough to find Polly. And there I have stuck with through the years, and it probably will be my last wife. And it's a good ending if you're looking for endings. Yeah.
Well, I certainly hope so. Actually, on that note, I know we briefly met you, but Polly, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm right here. I'm sitting here only because both of us have faulty memories nowadays,
Oh yeah.
and we help each other when needed. Sometimes the words just don't come, Michael.
Polly is into music too. She was a teacher in her working life, and she has one daughter and two lovely grandchildren in the East. I mentioned that already.
Yes.
Well, I would actually like to share with the audience that Polly has always come to the museum with Peter when he comes to speak,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's always nice to have both of you at the museum. And of course, on Zoom, it's great to have you here as well. So we're so grateful to have both of
Thank
you
you.
here.
He wants to say something.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Yeah, we have just a couple more questions. Have you been back to the Netherlands since?
Oh, yes. Many times. I love the country. It is a lovely country to live in and to visit, despite the Holocaust years. And the people are very friendly. The Dutch people have been very friendly to Jewish immigrants, like my family. And we have very good friends. I speak Dutch very fluently, thanks to my second wife, who was from Holland. And I learned the language again. And I have been staying with it since then. It's a difficult language. Dutch is not spoken by many people in the world. Consequently, when you go to school in Holland, you learn English, you learn French, you learn German. Even though during the war years, there was no German being taught, because everything German was hateful and despicable and better not brought up. But now, these days, you have these three languages every year. And I also learned Hebrew because I'm Jewish. And not that I speak Hebrew, but I could understand some of the words if it is spoken in a conversation. I have more talent in languages, I would say, than in algebra and in history. These fields were bad for me. I want maybe can tell you about my history teacher, who it was an old lady at that time already, who we liked music, and so in school after a concert we would get together, and she said, "Isn't music beautiful? I mean, it makes life so gorgeous." Then the next day, Peter failed a history test, and she said, "All Peter knows is music. He is not interested in history." Okay. um, uh, a lovely old lady. She's long since gone, but very good in her profession and very helpful and understanding. And but So I remember school gratefully. I was not very good at it. I had problems with tests and all that, but I had good friends. Not all of them that I see these days, but they're all also getting elderly. And my best friend passed away many years ago. I'm talking to his wife, a lovely young lady with 2 children. They keep you to your past, and not the Holocaust years, but the past, which were good before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. Holocaust was pretty rough, as we know, but I had basically a good life. I think I could have used my dad a little bit longer than I only knew him 47. I knew him 20, 15 years, and I could have used more dad, but I had a very, very strong and very lovely mother, and who I hope that her book, that her diary that is in the making and hopefully is being published someday, will show what kind of a interesting person she was. She could describe things so, like the place where she came from, the life that she lived, her first date, the coming of the first child, the coming of the second child, and all of them interesting and well written. I can't sell it yet because it is not in existence yet, but maybe someday we can give it to friends and people that are interested.
Well, thank you so much. Certainly look forward to reading that. I think the last question is a good one to end on. We have a comment from a teacher who would like to know what you think the best way is to teach about the Holocaust and against discrimination.
I think it's sitting right in front of this. The museum I have seen the museum many times now, and usually I do my talks at the museum. This is the first time that we're doing it at home. The museum is an excellent place for kids to find out about this horrible time that the whole world went through especially during the Holocaust years. We lost so many people. We fell behind in so many things. It is a part of history that should not be forgotten. And the museum is one place where you are reminded what has happened in a very good and professional way. I hope to God that the museum will open up one of these days again so that people can benefit, that children can benefit, and that children can find out that the Holocaust was real. There have been some attempts by people, writers, to say that the Holocaust never existed, that is made up by Jewish people or other people. I'm basically doing this to make sure it was right. It was actually happening. It is not a made-up story.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. And as a reminder, actually, yes, the museum is closed to the public right now. However, we provide regular programs online, and this coming school year, school semester, we will be providing virtual field trips and virtual survivor speakers for schools all over Los Angeles. And again, as a reminder to everybody, our admission, our programs are always free to the public, as are the survivors who founded our museum always mandated. While we are closed, we are still working just the same amount as always to ensure that this history will never be forgotten.
Right.
And we do a lot of programming with students still, so we're just virtual now, but we are still all doing our work. Peter and Polly, thank you so much for being here with us this morning and afternoon now. We really appreciate it, and your story is so important to share, and we're just so grateful to have both of you as part of our community. So we thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Our
And as a
pleasure. Thank you. You're doing a beautiful job too, by the way.
Yes, Michael. Thank you for
Excellent.
helping us today.
Excellent.
Of course, well, we're just so happy to have you here.
Thank you for being
And
here.
as a reminder, thank you. As a reminder to everybody as well, we have Holocaust survivor speakers on Zoom every Thursday at 11 o'clock. So you can check our museum's Facebook page or website for that. Next Thursday, we have Angelina Billauer, survivor from Germany, who will be speaking. So we hope you tune in then. And again, just follow our events, and we have a lot of programs for you and for the public. So
I know you.
Peter and Polly, and thank you to
Keep it
our
up.
audience. We will. Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Thank you,
having us.
Michael.